All right, everyone, welcome. We're so excited to have you join us today. Those of you who are in the room with us, welcome. Thank you for being here and making the time. Those of you who are watching after and catching up on content, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I am truly thrilled about the panel of leaders that we have coming in today. They're bringing such expertise and also great passion for artists and for folks who are working in the arts. And that is a combination that I think is going to make for a really wonderful presentation, but also a really robust Q&A at the end. So thank you so much for making the time to be with us. At this time, I'm going to have the panelists very quickly introduce themselves before we get started. So Ruby, may I start with you, and then we'll go to Koven and then Heather.
Hi, I'm Ruby Lerner. I'm based in New York City. I think most people know that I'm the founding director of the Creative Capital Foundation. That was the fourth organization I ran. So I've run a lot of artist-centered organizations before that. After retiring from Creative Capital, I have done a number of things, including working with the Soros Foundation on an international arts fellowship and serving on a lot of boards and advisory boards.
Thank you, Ruby. We are thrilled that you could join us here today. I think Koven will have you go next.
Hi, I'm Koven Smith. I'm Senior Director of Arts at the Knight Foundation. The foundation is headquartered in Miami, but I think as many of you know, we make grants in multiple cities around the United States, including Akron. And as part of my responsibility, I oversee a majority of our arts portfolio in Akron. Great to be here.
And I am Heather Meeker. I'm Executive Director of Summit Art Space. And I am delighted to actually be coming to you not from my office, but from John Knight's office in the building here at 140 East Market Street. And we'll channel some of that wonderful Knight energy on both sides of the Zoom room here. My experience has been working in organizations, performing arts, visual arts, education, cultural, over the course of the last 3 decades. And as executive director here at Summit Art Space, we are sort of a local artist incubator that helps provide a lot of services to support artists in all genres and disciplines.
Thank you so much, Heather. As you can see, we have a really wonderful panel here for you today for the funding options for individual artists. And we're going to get started with Ruby Lerner. We're going to go through some individual remarks and presentations. And then at the end, we're going to leave time for questions and having a sort of an authentic conversation with those on the call. So I'm going to turn it over to Ruby. Thank you so much for being here with us, Ruby.
I'm so excited. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm really excited to learn about what's happening in Akron. I'm going to just focus briefly on 2 areas today. One is tackling the grants universe, and the second is building your own constituencies. So I'm going to start with what I've learned about getting grants, both as a grant seeker for most of my career, and then as a grant giver later in my life to individual artists at Creative Capital. So my first piece of advice is to do your homework. There are a lot of grants out there, but they may not all be applicable to you. So know who you're applying to and what you're applying for. There are, as I'm sure you know, government grants, private sector grants at all levels, from the local to the national. You need help navigating that. And there are great resources online to aid you in your research. And you have wonderful organizations right there in Akron who can also help direct you. One of the things I think that's really important to do is review previous awards given by each funder that you might be interested in, because you want to ask the question, is your work in the ballpark of what that funding entity has been supporting? So that's a first question. But in a way, on the opposite side of that, it can also be useful to think a little bit outside the box. For instance, if your work is addressing an issue like, let's say, climate change, that could open up an entirely different group of possible supporters, maybe even outside the arts. Second, if you determine that there is a good match, write about your project idea clearly and without art jargon. What makes your project important? What makes your project urgent now? At Creative Capital, from the very beginning, we asked artists to talk about the impact that they hoped their project would have. If you're not seeing this yet on grant applications, I think you will. And it's a question you should be able to answer, whether in person or on an application. Next, your work sample. Your work sample is also really important. This is what gives a selection panel confidence in your ability to deliver on your idea. I have seen so many great project ideas derailed, sunk by a subpar work sample. So you need a great work sample. There's some things to consider, and that is that all award processes these days are competitive. You might not get selected in the first or second time that you apply. That is the way things are. Don't be dispirited. Try to get feedback on your proposal if you can. Not all agencies make that available, but if they do, take it. It will help you put together more compelling proposals in the future. I know it's frustrating to continue to have to apply to things. Believe me, I've been turned down plenty. But I say apply, apply, apply to everything you're eligible for. First, it's good practice. And second, you just never know. At Creative Capital, we tried to build value into the entire process, even if you didn't get the grant. And artists have often told me that just filling out the application taught them so much about their projects. More importantly, though, are all the people who might be reading your proposal. And I know this is not front of mind, you're not thinking about that. But for instance, at Creative Capital, if you made it to the final selection panel and you didn't end up getting the grant, 11 people from your field, leaders in your field, would still have become familiar with you and your project. I think it's obvious why this is important, because these are the very people who might be sitting on other selection committees, and they might be curators at institutions where you would kill to have your work shown. I cannot begin to tell you how many times reviewers asked us if it would be okay for them to contact a particular artist whose proposal they had read, because they didn't care whether we gave that artist a grant or not. They were interested in the project. And we always said, great, please contact them and be sure to tell them where you learned about them. This is one good reason. I'll come back to this in a second, but this is a good reason to have a comprehensive website if you don't already, in case someone wants to know more about you. That's the first place they're going. All right, but today I also want to spend a few minutes thinking about a different approach to getting your work supported through individuals, beyond ticket buying or beyond purchasing your art. In other words, beyond the transactional. A question that I have been asking for decades is, what if every artist could build a unique, permanent, and sustaining support network around themselves and their work? In 2008, Kevin Kelly, who was one of the founders of Wired magazine, wrote an influential piece called 1,000 True Fans. Some of you may have seen this. He valued each of those 1,000 fans at $100 a year to you. He suggested that if you can collect $100 a year from each of those people, or $100,000 a year, that you'll do just fine, because that will give you the freedom to make whatever you choose, because you'll have at least the foundation, the beginnings of a foundation of a supportive community behind you. If you spin out this philosophy of deep support from a broad community, as opposed to support from a narrower, small group of people or foundations representing extreme wealth, if you spin that out to its logical conclusion, that logical conclusion is Taylor Swift. It's 2024, so I had to bring her up. Artists like Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Kevin Hart really intrigued me because they are masters of control, and everything starts with their devoted audiences. Taylor has almost 500 million followers, Beyonce over 300 million, Kevin close to 90 million. More importantly, early in Kevin Hart's stand-up career, even when he had very small audiences, he got all of his fans' email addresses at every show so that he could communicate directly with them. Many of his fans became repeat attenders and then brought their friends, growing his base even further. This is the way it happens. These large fan bases have allowed each of them to have more control over their careers, and their successes have enabled them to become really generous. This is another thing that really excites me. Taylor gave out more than $55 million in bonuses to her staff and crew, accompanied by handwritten notes. My favorite part. She makes donations to food banks in each of the communities where she performs. She's donated to cancer charities, to emergency relief efforts, and directly to individuals going through crises. Kevin created Help from the Heart charity. Beyonce's foundation supports small businesses, educational scholarships, and so on. So beyond the power they now have to engineer their own careers, it's their fan bases that provide the ability for these three artists to be generous with others. All right, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me here in Akron, Ohio? You might be thinking my situation is so different from what's possible for a mega celebrity. Yes, but there's a concept that I really like and that I've thought a lot about over the years, and that is the mass micro niche. This idea basically says that no matter how quirky something is, there will be others out there who are interested in it as well. Maybe it's only a handful of people where you are, but maybe there are a few more people in Birmingham, Alabama, or New Orleans, Rio, Manila. You just don't know. It will add up. So part of your job, and for me, this is a really hopeful thing because we have this incredible tool now, the internet, means that you can now find this potentially global audience for your work. So to think about, how will I find these people, and then how will I nurture that relationship? So we are not, as I said, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, or Kevin, but ask yourself, what could you do to gain more power and control for your work and for your ability to create opportunities for others? So I have a few thoughts, again, based on many years of working with artists. The most important thing you can do, build your lists. I have been shocked working with sometimes mature and successful artists who say, oh, I have a gallery. I don't need a contact list. My attitude is, wow, really? Did you ever hear of a gallery going out of business? Did you ever hear about a gallery dropping an artist? That gallery's list belongs to them, not to you. And of course, most of us don't have any kind of representation at all. So build your list. Your mailing list and social media followers can be part of a path to artistic freedom and to building a sustaining community. This does not happen overnight, but I think if you take this seriously and you're proactive, in 3 to 5 years, you might begin to see a really robust community of support. So once you have your lists, you need to communicate with the constituency that you've built. You might be quite active on social media, and that is great, but your presence there does need to be supplemented by vehicles where you can tell a deeper story about your mission and your projects, like a website and a periodic news vehicle like a newsletter. Your audience will want to share in your successes. They will be excited about what you're up to. And if you have an authentic relationship with them, they can help you with your challenges too. What will it take to create an authentic, deep engagement with your constituency so that they will want to go on your journey with you? This is a question I think that we all have to ask now, whether we're an institution or an individual. There's one more aspect of the Taylor Swift phenomenon that I find fascinating, and that is the bracelets. You might be hearing a little bit more about them later on. She has made a community out of her audience with the making and trading of bracelets. I think actually it's more like they've made a community out of themselves. They're bracelet making parties where Swift fans get to know each other. So a question for you, another question is, how can you make a community out of your audience? What is your bracelet? Some of you might be familiar with the musician Amanda Palmer. This is maybe a little bit closer to home than Taylor. Here's what she said a few years ago about her relationship with Patreon. Again, I'm sure many of you know Patreon, a platform that allows you to create that kind of subscriber base for your practice. This Patreon is for people who want to help sustain my ability and freedom to make what I want, when I want, liberated from commercial interests by paying me a set amount of money every time I create something. If each of her 17,000 Patreon supporters, and that is a list I want to assure you that has been built slowly over time, committed to just $1 a month, that would be $204,000 a year. I can't speak for you, but I would be very happy with that. So of course, yes, apply to everything that's out there that you're eligible for. and keep applying. But also think about beginning now, today, to gradually move yourself to a place of support by a much wider constituency than just foundations or government agencies. Honor the people who are already in your network and keep building it out. The independence that you can build for yourself over time will not only provide stability for you, for your practice in the long term, but it will also make it possible for you to be more generous with your colleagues. Thank you.
Ruby, thank you so much. I was taking notes, and everyone, I just popped in a couple key points that I heard from Ruby as we were going through it. But Ruby, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, and pop them into the chat. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Koven Smith. Koven, that's an act to follow. So I appreciate that it's you.
Well, that's sweet of you to say. Thank you. And always happy to be on a panel with Heather and Ruby. This is just like, what a day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a somewhat overlooked part of the process for getting and applying for grants, which is that initial contact that you have with a program officer at a foundation. So here, as I'm talking, I'm going to use the words grant maker and program officer kind of interchangeably. Just think of this as being, your first contact with someone at a foundation who is in a position to possibly work on a grant with you as a person seeking a grant. Part of the reason I'd like to focus on this moment is that so much of the subsequent grant making process is, or in some cases isn't, really set in motion during this initial contact. And I think especially for those who don't talk to foundations for a living, because you're not a development officer or something like that, I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding about what these contacts with grant makers or program officers really are for and what they do. Which is to say that really what you want out of an initial contact with, let's say, me as a grant maker is not at the end of that conversation for me to say, I will definitely fund your project, but rather you want me to say, I will definitely take your call the next time you reach out. You are really, in this initial call, you're starting a relationship with the foundation, and you want to ensure that that relationship really starts off on the best foot. And partially, alluding to what Ruby said earlier, is that we may have a great first call, and it may be that we are not really in a position to fund the project you're bringing to us now, but we might be interested in funding something else that you propose down the line. So, and conversely, if a relationship or if that initial call feels too transactional, it may even be, well, we're funding this project, but not likely to fund things in the future. So we're here, I'm going to talk really about three kind of main stages: getting prepared for that first contact, for that call, what to do during the call, and then what to do after the call. I'm going to keep saying first contact because it tickles my Star Trek fancy for those of you who are Vulcans on the call. But so anyway, so here we go. As far as getting prepared, if you have not previously met with a given program officer, definitely send an email first. Introduce yourself, your work, and give a general summary of the project you're looking to fund. You don't need to give a ton of detail here, but enough for the program officer when they come into that call to know if it makes sense to even have this call, or if, in some cases, like people will come to me from Miami and they'll say, hey, I've got this project in Miami. I'll say, well, actually, I don't oversee Miami, so I'll refer you to our other program officers. So give me enough information to sort of know how to route the conversation we're going to have. And then just to reiterate what Ruby said, in advance of the initial call, do your research. Almost all foundations have a what we fund section of their website. And while it's often vague, you can still get a sense of what kinds of things a foundation is looking to do. So, for instance, like, does a funder really focus on need, or are they more impact focused? In the case of Knight Foundation, we're an impact funder. So pitches that are focused on specific needs or that are more charity focused are not really going to be appropriate in scope for the kinds of grants that we tend to give. You also should look to see if the funder has a specific domain expertise. In Knight Foundation's case, our arts program team focuses on arts and technology. So proposals that are sort of outside of that focus, while interesting, are not necessarily what we're likely to move forward with. And in some cases, and particularly so in Knight's case, you want to understand whether the funder funds only in certain areas of the country. Knight Foundation funds in really only 8 cities. So if you're outside of those, we're unlikely to move forward with something. Although it can mean maybe you address that head on in your proposal. Sometimes we get that people will come to us and say, hey, we're not in a Knight city, but we believe our work really aligns well with your focus, and we'd like to talk more about that. And that's okay. So I will assume when we have our first call that you already know all this information. So if your initial call starts with you asking me to basically give you this information in person, and it doesn't seem like you have a basic knowledge of what we do, that's not going to be a good way to start. If your first question is, like in our case, oh, do you fund arts and technology? Like I would expect that research to have been done already before we get to that moment. This is going to sound self-serving, and to a certain extent it is. But another thing that I think people who have really successful first calls do that sets them apart is often they will read the bios of the person that they are getting ready to talk to. Most foundations publish biographies, even short ones, of the program officers on their team. So if you're meeting with somebody, you can read up about them. And that's mostly important, mostly insofar as it might help you to understand what things you really might need to explain in more detail, or what things you can skip over. Like in my case, I worked in museums for 20 years, so you don't need to talk a ton about just sort of general museum operations to me. Versus if you were talking to Michelle, a program officer also on our team, her background is in dance. So, if you're coming to her with a dance proposal, like there's probably a lot of detail that you don't need to go into and you can skip around. Whereas I might need to hear some of that because I might not know all that material. So in terms of preparation, really know in advance what you're looking to accomplish with that call. Have talking points, but ensure that you've got plenty of room for back and forth, and have specific questions that you want to ask the grant maker you're talking to. It can be hard if maybe we only have a 30-minute call for you to, go through 28 minutes of a prepared presentation, and then in the last 2 minutes say, well, Koven, what do you think? That you want to have a lot of back and forth and a lot of opportunity for us to discuss and redirect if we need to. So I don't discourage prepared presentations, but often with the limited amount of time you have in these initial calls, sometimes they may be as short as 15 minutes. They're not always the best way to start. So, just to reiterate, I think this moment is really you should consider it the beginning of a conversation. It's not the best place to try and sort of close the deal. In this first conversation, I don't need to know all of the details about your proposal, but enough of the big picture to determine whether it makes sense for us to keep having more conversations and to continue talking. So as far as during the call itself, a few things. First, and this may seem obvious, but most important is to show up on time. And that's just to say that in most cases, there are always more people that are looking to have conversations with program officers than we have available hours. So if you've scheduled time and don't show up, that means that someone else who didn't get a call is not having that opportunity. So please, if you can't make it, always cancel ahead of time, let us know. We understand that things happen, so canceling is not a big deal as long as we know ahead of time and can reschedule somebody else into that slot. So in terms of perspective during the call, me as a grant maker, the question I'll be asking myself first off is this something we could fund? And if the answer to that is yes, then I'm going to be asking, is this something that we should fund? And what that really means is that I'm often going to zero in really on the how and the what questions first before we really get to the why. And I think for especially a lot of arts grant seekers, this sort of feels backwards because the why is usually the reason you're doing it in the first place. But what that means is that if you hook me with the why, and then it turns out the how is something like, well, we want to publish a weekly magazine, which is like, we don't fund those sort of activities, then just everybody's disappointed at the end of the day. So it's important to kind of understand, quite literally for me, where is the money going to go? What is it going to support? Is it going to be equipment? Is it going to be staff? Is it going to be archiving? Is it going to be, you want to redesign your website? So that's not to say that I'm not eager to hear why you're doing it, but often whether we do or don't proceed will not turn immediately, at least, on those questions. And if I don't really know what the what and the how are by the end of our call, then the next call is going to be much harder, because then we have to have that conversation much further down the road. So another thing that I think sometimes can be a little hard to adjust to in a conversation with a grant maker is that often we will be interested in talking about the scope of a given project almost right off the bat. So even if we're interested in the work, we may or may not be in a position to fund the entirety of what you're proposing. So often in the first call, we may immediately jump into exploring the scope of a possible grant. So we might say, hey, is there just a portion of this that might be appropriate for us to fund? Or is there a smaller pilot version or a minimum viable product sort of version of this that we could fund that would put us in a better position for a bigger grant later on? So, expect that we may try to sort of like pull things apart almost right from the start. And don't be disappointed necessarily in that, because that means that we're interested and we're looking for a way to work through this, even if we can't support necessarily the entire scope. And then just a point is that on the call itself, it is totally okay if you're nervous. These calls are totally unnatural. It's a very weird situation. It's a weird situation for me to basically be giving away someone else's money. It's a weird position that this is even the way the world works. So it is okay to be upfront about how nervous you are, especially if it's the first time you've ever had a conversation like this. Use notes, don't worry about it. Just make sure that you remember what you wanted to say and that you get your points. And part of the reason that I say that is that we are really looking for honesty a lot more than we are perfection. I can't speak for everyone in my position, but I know for me, we're looking not only, is this a good project, but also, is this going to be a productive relationship over the long term? Because, if we make a grant, the money goes out, but then we may have a reporting relationship that goes on for years after that moment. And we want to know that it's like, do I feel like we can have a good and trusting relationship over the long term? And that impression starts almost right from the beginning. And then after the call, there's really just kind of two things to note, which is just to say, if there are action items that come out of the call, immediately note those down and follow up. So specifically, if the program officer asks you for additional documentation, make sure that they get that. If the grant maker themselves has action items, like to say, hey, I'll follow up internally on that question and get back to you. That's my responsibility to note down. But if any specific action items for you come out, make sure that you know what those are and that you follow up as quickly as possible. Having just said that, the second thing is be prepared for long lead times. Unfortunately, foundations are, although it doesn't always seem that way externally, we're often working with very small staffs and very large portfolios. So, it may be that even if we have a really fabulous first call and it's something that I am really interested in funding and I want to move forward, it still might be 6 months before we talk again. And that's not personal. That's just how the job goes. So, I won't speak for other program officers, but I know in my case, sometimes if we have a really great first conversation and you feel like it's been a long time since we've talked and you'd like to update or like to see kind of where we're at, feel free to check in. more often than not, I'll say, hey, you're still very much on my radar. We've got some other stuff to take care of, and I'll get right back to you. And then just the last thing I'll say that can be difficult is if there is a foundation that you do have a relationship with, once you've sort of established that, and especially if your relationship is with one program officer, pay attention to transitions there at that foundation. Because if if your relationship is, let's say, with me or like with Michelle, as I mentioned earlier on our team, and one of us leaves the foundation or goes to another position in the foundation, it helps to know who's coming in to replace them and to have that conversation. And sometimes if you can, you want to try and catch the program officer before they leave that position so they can help transition you to the next person. That can be one of the most difficult kind of moments in a foundation, is sometimes those initial contacts, if they haven't progressed all the way to a grant is being worked on actively, some of those opportunities can get lost in the transitions with personnel. So I think I went mostly on time, slightly over possibly, but so that's it. Thanks.
Koven, thank you so much. That was enormously helpful. I was frantically taking notes, and if I can put them into something that will make sense for all of you, I'll drop them in the chat. But thank you, and thanks for being so direct and honest about what works and what doesn't work. We really, really appreciate it. Those of us who have been writing grants for a while know how valuable what you just shared is. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Heather Meeker, and I'm going to be her admin support on this one. So if anything goes wrong with the PowerPoint, we know who to blame. All right, Heather?
I'm usually having to do it by myself. So I'm just so thankful for the partnership. And I just want to say too, I'm going to come around to this in a second, but the work that Summit Art Space is able to do both because of and in partnership with Arts Now really is something that is so meaningful here for us, and we hope for all of the artists who are here in Summit and contiguous counties, which is our footprint. So I'm here today to sort of talk about what happens in order for an artist to get funds from a foundation or an outside source, or potentially even individual donors. How might an individual artist legally get access to those funds? And there is a mechanism for this. It is called fiscal sponsorship. And I know some of you have been involved with some of this over the years. And for many of you, this might be a new concept. So just level setting here, we're going to go over in a very quick way the major components of what fiscal sponsorship is all about. Summit Art Space, our mission is to connect artists to the resources that they need to thrive professionally, creatively, and financially. And this is something that my colleague, Natalie Grace-Hemmer-Patrick, our Director of Artist Resources, and I feel very passionately about, but we are also very new to as an organization. We've literally been doing this for under 2 years, and there is a lot to learn, but we know that in order for artists to get access to funds, that the capacity to manage and support those is tremendously important. So again, we're delighted to be working with Nicole. I'll tell you a little bit about a thing on the tail end here that is kind of exciting for all of us. We sort of serve as an artist incubator. I see many names here in this group of individuals who have participated in some of our artist care programming, whether it's a professional practice workshop. I see some members of our artist launchpad cohorts. We continue to move, sorry, Nicole, you can move forward one. We continue to move forward in terms of defining what types of programming are most helpful to local artists here in Akron. And in our greater Akron community, and figuring out how we remove barriers to artists being able to do their work in the most effective ways that they can for their own individual practice. So what do we do at Summit Art Space? A number of things, which I'm not going to belabor today, but suffice to say that if you are a practicing local artist, we definitely want you to know about us. So stop in anytime, call us, email us. We're here to try to help with any of the elements that you might need as you are developing what your practice is all about. And we encourage you to connect with the other artists who are here in this space, either as resident artists or artists working within our programming, because the peer networking is what we have found has just been the most helpful thing in terms of each individual artist figuring out what their practice looks like. So what is fiscal sponsorship? Fiscal sponsorship is a legal arrangement. It is something that happens between the artist or a project that an artist is driving and an IRS recognized 501c3. And there are many of those out there. Summit Art Space is one of them, but not every organization gets into fiscal sponsorship because there are a lot of legalities and protections that we need to make sure are in place, since we will be, as the charitable tax exempt organization, receiving funds on behalf of the artist or the project. We then send those we're going to talk more about the parameters around this, but we send those funds out to the artist in order to realize the project itself. And there are different models for fiscal sponsor relationships, but generally, and the way we think about it, a grant or a project must fall within the organizational mission of the sponsor and be charitable in nature. So first and foremost, because all of you are artists and this you are generally involved in projects that are about creating and realizing work, that is something that we feel is very mission aligned and that we want to dig into here over the next few years. Next slide, Nicole, thank you. The fiscal sponsor must retain control of and discretion over funds and how they are used. So in this case, Summit Art Space, as the sponsor, is on the hook for to the funders for ensuring that the funds are used in the way that the funders or the donors wanted them to be used. The donor intention is what we're talking about here. We also maintain records that demonstrate that the funds were used for 501c3 purposes. And in our case too, we specifically ask for support that demonstrates it's for your particular project. And we also have a legally binding agreement with any artist or project that is that is a fiscal sponsee, because we definitely have protocols and procedures for how that is done. And that is to protect, first and foremost, you as artists, Summit Art Space as an organization, and the funders in terms of what the donations or the grants were particularly meant to do. And by the way, I'm just putting these wonderful pictures of pets in here because this is just not, this is hard stuff to talk about. It's not easy for anyone, actually. And so when I originally put these slides together for another purpose last year, I was like, let's just get some cats on there. And this actually is good. As in all good things, there's a reason for this. So when we come to the end, you're going to be impressed. Fiscal sponsor services, what do we do? So providing IRS determination letter and partner letter for grant application purposes. When an individual artist applies to a funder, if that funder is accepting proposals from individual artists with fiscal sponsors, that's something you'll always need to ask. We can provide those supporting documents to make sure that all the ducks are in a row. And we work with many of the local foundations here in the Akron area to do that. We will receive and process the grants and donations. If needed, that acknowledgements, and actually, anytime something comes in through our system, we're acknowledging to grantors and donors that it was received. We then can advance and reimburse money to the artist or project with documentation, and that is exceedingly important. And there are also elements of reporting that we do to a variety of entities, including the IRS and to the donor themselves or the funder themselves. When you are looking for a fiscal sponsor, you want a 501c3 organization that has mission alignment with your project. It helps if it is a well-established, reputable, and credible organization, because you definitely want an organization that's paying attention to financial controls and ensuring that compliance with federal regulations and state regulations are in play. You want to make sure there is sufficient capacity and infrastructure for management and reporting, and that the organization has experience fiscal sponsoring projects and can provide references, other artists who have gone through this process, so that you can find out more about what that does take. So Summit Art Space, as we are doing this, we try really hard. Although some of you know that we've been going through a data migration with a few other nonprofits here locally, and anytime a data migration happens, things get a little sticky. But we do, yeah, we provide a solid fiscal foundation. We are legally required to exercise a certain amount of oversight over the activities for the project, and so we will always be asking questions and ensuring that we have the right information that we need to make those disbursements. We like to monitor how those funds are spent because we keep the records and the backup documents and the reporting. And we also do charge a fee for those services. Typically, that is a percentage. Right now, our percentage is 6%. As we move into this new data platform, we're figuring out what that looks like for us because we're going to be offering some new services. So that's something that should be worked into your proposals or your thought process as you are accepting this money, is that any fiscal sponsor is generally going to be charging a fee of some sort for these services. Most importantly, for all of this, and you can go to the next slide, Nicole. We want to make sure that as a fiscal sponsor, we are providing a built-in support team because we want your project to succeed. We are here as a facilitator to try to get these funds into an artist's hands to realize the goals of that project. And we hope that it will, at least in terms of the whole 501c3 status, there are entities that want to get that status, and that is really terrific. For those that do not, that aren't there yet, or maybe are just in process, we can eliminate some of the challenge of applying for that until an artist is ready, if an artist is ever ready for that, because it's a model that comes with its own challenges. Fiscally sponsored projects are eligible to apply for most government and foundation grants. But again, you need to make sure that the organization, that the funder is accepting proposals in that way. And while it doesn't take away from the work that you will need to do to manage the funds and the process as the artist who is driving the project, we hope that we're providing some accessible and affordable tools to make it easier with a knowledge base of local professionals who understand what your project is about and get what you are trying to do as a local practicing artist. And finally, I will say that through our relationship with Arts Now, we are, again, migrating to a new platform that actually facilitates fiscal sponsorship for us at Summit Art Space in new ways and makes it possible for us to offer a suite of services at a very affordable price where artists can, as Ruby was talking about very early in this presentation, really pay attention to mail list management, get access to funds in a very easy way that ties and makes payments both to you as artist and to the other vendors and folks that you might be working with, can help to digitize this and facilitate this more effectively, can provide email marketing, and even for the project, provide budgeting and accounting if it's something that artists are interested in. So that is all coming in 2025. We're in the midst of building all of that right now, but it's definitely something that we're really excited about and hope that it can be a true that it can be a transformative kind of thing when we talk about how are you making sure that your people are close to you? How are you building that network beyond just a grant funded project? How are you able to manage the, as Ruby called it, the devoted audience, right? I think that is so tremendously important. And so that's my little picture here is the cat paw with the Karma is a cat bracelet that is on here. Karma is a cat. I think that if all of us can work on building those relationships and really digging into what it means to connect individually with the people who not only engage in our work, but invest in local artists who they are connected to, then we are really starting to accomplish something great. That's me, and I'm sure I was too long as well, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. Heather, thank you so much. I think understanding the opportunity around grant funding is so important for artists and individuals, especially in Greater Akron and Summit County. And so knowing that we have a partner that we trust that can help walk alongside of them for that fiscal sponsorship and explain the intricacies, I think is really helpful. And I'm going to give you a question right off the bat. Sharon asked, does Summit Art Space do this only for Akron-based artists, or would Cuyahoga County artists be eligible as well?
As we start to roll this out, it's not just for Akron artists. It's not just for Summit artists. Summit Art Space's geographic footprint is Summit and contiguous counties. So we would be an option for a Cuyahoga County artist. And I will also say in Cuyahoga County, there is Assembly for the Arts, which also does fiscal management for artist projects as well. And so there are a few of us here in Northeast Ohio that are making programming out of this, artist-centered and aligned programming out of this. And I would encourage everybody to check out, you know, you want to find the right fit for you in terms of fiscal sponsorship. So, you know, definitely something that we can provide more information about. Great question.
Thanks, Heather. All right, everyone, we are going to get into the Q&A portion of the conversation. And so for our friends who are joining us after the event, we're going to go ahead and end the recording now. Thank you so much for being with us, but we want to make sure that folks feel super comfortable asking their questions. And sometimes that can feel a little daunting if it's going to be recorded for all time. So I'm going to end the recording, but thank you so much for being with us today.